Glass exploded inward like a symphony of destruction, sending crystalline fragments dancing through the evening air as black-clad figures poured through the shattered windows. The children's screams pierced the suburban twilight, raw and primal, as assault rifles swung toward the dinner table where 8-year-old Zara still clutched her plastic fork. "Get down! Get down now!" The commands roared through the modest living room, drowning out the gentle hum of the television and the distant sizzle from the backyard grill. Marcus Washington had been flipping chicken thighs just moments before, his weathered hands steady on the spatula as aromatic smoke curled up from his homemade barbecue sauce. The recipe had been his grandmother's secret, passed down through 3 generations of Sunday family gatherings. Brown sugar, molasses, apple cider vinegar, and a dozen carefully measured spices that filled the air with rich, complex sweetness. He'd been humming an old Motown classic, lost in the simple pleasure of feeding his family, when the first window exploded. Now he lay face down on his own kitchen floor, powerful hands zip-tied behind his back, while his wife Keisha pressed their terrified children against the wall. 6-year-old Marcus Jr. whimpered for his daddy, tears streaming down his chocolate-brown cheeks as tactical boots trampled through their home. The SWAT officers moved with practiced efficiency, overturning furniture, dumping drawers, their radios crackling with urgent communications that made no sense in this context of domestic tranquility. "Where are the drugs?" The team leader's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. His face remained hidden behind tactical gear, but his tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. "We know you're cooking in here. The whole neighborhood can smell it." Marcus lifted his head slightly, confusion clouding his dark eyes. "Cooking what I'm just making dinner for my family." His voice remained steady despite the circumstances. Years of teaching high school mathematics, having trained him to stay calm under pressure. "My barbecue sauce. That's all. Check the backyard." The explanation fell on deaf ears as officers continued their systematic destruction of the Washington family's peaceful evening. Couch cushions flew through the air, kitchen cabinets gaped open like wounded mouths, and the children's artwork was trampled underfoot. Keisha's nursing textbooks scattered across the floor, pages fluttering like wounded birds as her dreams of becoming a registered nurse literally fell apart around her. 3 hours earlier, Karen Pemberton had been tending her prize-winning roses when the first hints of smoke drifted over the perfectly manicured hedge that separated her property from the Washington family's modest backyard. Her pale blue eyes narrowed as she inhaled deeply, her thin lips pursing with disapproval. The scent was complex, layered with unfamiliar spices that triggered something deep in her suspicious mind. Karen had lived on Maple Street for 37 years, watching the neighborhood slowly change around her. She remembered when every face had been familiar, when every family had looked and sounded just like hers. The Washingtons had moved in 2 years ago, and though they'd always been polite, even friendly, something about them unsettled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "That smell isn't normal barbecue," she muttered to herself, pressing her face against the kitchen window for a better view. Through the slats in the fence, she could see Marcus working over his grill, methodically basting meat with a dark, aromatic sauce. The smoke was thicker than usual, carrying exotic notes that reminded her of the documentaries she'd seen about inner-city drug operations. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. Karen had always prided herself on being a concerned citizen, someone who kept watch over the neighborhood's moral fabric. She'd called the authorities before about loud music, unleashed dogs, and suspicious-looking visitors. This time felt different, more urgent. 911. What's your emergency? I need to report suspicious drug activity. Karen's voice carried the weight of righteous conviction. My neighbors are cooking something illegal in their backyard. The smell is overwhelming, and there are children present. You need to send someone immediately." The dispatcher's questions came quickly, professionally. Address, duration of activity, number of people involved. Karen answered each query with growing confidence, painting a picture of suburban drug manufacturing that would demand immediate tactical response. She emphasized the presence of children, the unusual nature of the smoke, the suspicious behavior she claimed to have observed. "They're trying to hide it by pretending it's just dinner," she added with calculated precision. "But I know what I'm smelling. This isn't normal food preparation." The dispatch went out within minutes, tagged as a high-priority drug manufacturing operation with potential child endangerment. Squad cars began converging on Maple Street from 3 directions, while the SWAT team prepared for a tactical entry. The wheels of justice, once set in motion by Karen's accusations, moved with devastating efficiency toward an innocent family's front door. Marcus had always taken pride in his weekend barbecue rituals. Saturday evenings meant family time, meant carrying on the traditions his own father had passed down during long summer afternoons in Alabama. The sauce recipe was sacred, a closely guarded secret that connected him to generations of Washington men who had worked with their hands and fed their families with love. He'd spent the afternoon preparing the chicken, massaging it with his special dry rub before letting it rest in the refrigerator. The sauce had been simmering on the stove since noon, filling the house with the deep, rich aroma of caramelizing sugars and complex spices. Keisha had laughed, saying the smell was so powerful it would draw neighbors from 3 blocks away. The children had been playing in the backyard, their laughter mixing with the sizzle of meat hitting the hot grill grates. Zara was teaching her little brother to throw a baseball, their voices bright with the kind of pure joy that made all of Marcus's hard work worthwhile. He taught mathematics at Jefferson High School, spending his days trying to inspire teenagers who often seemed more interested in their phones than in polynomial equations. But here, in his own backyard, surrounded by his family and the familiar comfort of his father's barbecue traditions, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from simple, honest pleasures. The chicken was nearly done. The sauce had reached that perfect balance of sweet and tangy, and his family was happy. Life felt complete in these precious moments. The first police car appeared at the end of Maple Street at exactly 7:43 p.m., followed quickly by 2 more. Marcus glanced up from his grill, mild curiosity replacing his contentment as the vehicles approached with unusual urgency. Emergency lights painted the suburban landscape in alternating red and blue, creating a surreal atmosphere that seemed completely out of place in their quiet neighborhood. "Daddy, why are the police cars coming this way?" Zara's voice carried a note of concern that made Marcus's protective instincts sharpen. He set down his spatula and moved toward the back door, thinking perhaps there had been an accident or some kind of emergency that would require him to bring the children inside. The tactical team arrived 60 seconds later, their black vehicles disgorging heavily armed officers who moved with military precision toward the Washington family's front entrance. Marcus heard the commotion from the backyard and began walking toward the house, completely unaware that he was about to become the target of the approaching storm. "Keisha, bring the kids inside," he called through the screen door, his voice carrying just a hint of unease. "Something's happening out front." Those were the last words he would speak as a free man for the next 4 hours. The entry was explosive and overwhelming, designed to disorient and control through shock and superior firepower. Marcus found himself on the kitchen floor before he could process what was happening, his face pressed against the cool linoleum while his children screamed in terror. The officers shouted over each other, their commands creating a cacophony of aggression that transformed his peaceful home into a war zone. "Where's the lab?" the team leader demanded, his voice muffled by tactical gear. We know you're manufacturing. The complaint said the whole block smells like chemicals. Marcus tried to speak, tried to explain, but the zip ties had been pulled so tight that his hands were already going numb. There's no lab, he managed to say between ragged breaths. Just my barbecue sauce. It's been cooking all day on the stove. The officer's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. Right. Barbecue sauce that requires a full SWAT response. Try again. Keisha had managed to get the children into the corner of the living room, her nursing training helping her stay calm, even as her world collapsed around her. She watched helplessly as strangers destroyed her home, searching for evidence of crimes that existed only in someone's imagination. Her textbooks lay scattered and torn. 2 years of careful study reduced to damaged paper and broken dreams. Please, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. You're terrifying our children. Whatever you think we've done, we haven't. Marcus teaches at Jefferson High. I'm a nursing student. We're just a normal family. One of the younger officers paused in his search, something in Keisha's tone giving him momentary doubt. But his supervisor quickly redirected his attention back to the systematic destruction of the Washington family's possessions. The complaint had been specific, detailed, convincing. Someone in the neighborhood had reported drug manufacturing, and SWAT teams didn't deploy for harmless misunderstandings. The search continued for another 20 minutes before the team leader finally approached the stove, where Marcus's grandmother's barbecue sauce had been simmering for hours. The pot was large, commercial-sized, filled with a dark liquid that had been reducing slowly all afternoon. The aroma was indeed powerful, complex, unlike anything the officer had encountered in his 15 years of law enforcement. He dipped a clean spoon into the mixture and tasted it carefully, his expression changing from suspicion to confusion to something approaching embarrassment. The sauce was magnificent, rich with layers of flavor that spoke of culinary tradition and family pride. Brown sugar, molasses, vinegar, and spices created a symphony of taste that was clearly, unmistakably, exactly what Marcus had claimed it to be. Sir, the officer called to his supervisor, his voice considerably quieter than before. You need to taste this. The realization dawned slowly, like sunrise creeping over a battlefield. There was no drug lab, no chemical manufacturing, no criminal enterprise hidden behind suburban normalcy. Just a family man making dinner for his wife and children, using a recipe that had been passed down through generations of loving hands. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the quiet sobs of traumatized children and the distant sound of neighbors gathering on the sidewalk. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood, drawing curious onlookers who whispered among themselves about the dramatic police action that had shattered their Saturday evening peace. Karen Pemberton stood among them, her face a mask of righteous satisfaction that slowly crumbled as she overheard fragments of conversation between the officers. The phrases, "no drugs found," and "false alarm," penetrated her consciousness like physical blows, each word stripping away another layer of her certainty. She tried to fade back into the crowd, to disappear before anyone connected her to the devastating mistake that had just terrorized an innocent family. But Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street had seen Karen talking to the police earlier, had watched her pointing toward the Washington house with unmistakable accusation. The neighborhood's informal communication network began buzzing with a different kind of information. Karen called this in, Mrs. Rodriguez whispered to her husband. I saw her talking to that first officer, pointing at their house. She did this. The whispers spread through the growing crowd like ripples on a disturbed pond. Eyes began turning toward Karen, expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding to something much darker. The children were still crying inside the house, their innocence shattered by an experience no child should ever endure. Marcus was finally helped to his feet, the zip ties cut from his wrists, as formal apologies began flowing from the officers who had just destroyed his evening and traumatized his family. But apologies couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't erase the terror from his children's eyes, or repair the trust that had been broken along with his windows. "We received a complaint about drug manufacturing," the team leader explained, his voice heavy with regret. The report was very specific, very convincing. Someone called in a detailed account of suspicious chemical smells and illegal activity. Marcus rubbed his wrists where the restraints had cut into his skin, his dark eyes scanning the damage to his home. Furniture overturned, possessions scattered. The peaceful sanctuary he'd built for his family violated by strangers with guns. The barbecue was ruined, dinner destroyed, and his children would carry the memory of this night for the rest of their lives. "Who made the complaint?" Keisha asked, her nursing instincts already assessing the psychological trauma her children had endured. "We have a right to know who accused us of crimes we didn't commit." The answer would have to wait for official channels, but the neighborhood gossip network was already providing its own version of justice. Karen Pemberton found herself increasingly isolated as the crowd of neighbors began to understand exactly what had happened and who was responsible for the evening's catastrophe. David Chen, who lived directly across from the Washingtons, stepped forward to address the lead officer. "I've been smelling that barbecue sauce all afternoon," he said clearly, his voice carrying in the evening air. "Marcus makes it every Saturday. It's incredible. My whole family looks forward to the aroma. There's nothing suspicious about it except how good it smells." Other neighbors began speaking up, their voices joining in a chorus of support for the Washington family and condemnation for whatever misguided person had triggered the catastrophic response. The Washingtons were well known in the community, respected for their quiet dignity and Marcus's reputation as an excellent teacher. "Marcus tutored my daughter in calculus," added Sarah Williams from 3 houses down. "He spent hours helping her for free, never asked for anything in return. He's one of the best people in this neighborhood." The testimonials continued, painting a picture of a family that had been targeted not for any criminal behavior, but for the simple act of existing while different in a community where someone felt threatened by that difference. The evening air grew thick with more than just barbecue smoke, as the implications of what had happened began to sink in. Karen knew she had to leave, had to escape before the growing crowd turned its attention fully toward her. She began backing away from the scene, hoping to slip away unnoticed in the gathering darkness. But Mrs. Rodriguez's voice cut through the night air like a blade. "There she goes!" the older woman called out, pointing directly at Karen's retreating figure. "Karen Pemberton from the Blue House. She's the one who called the police. I saw her talking to them," pointing at the Washingtons' house. The crowd turned as one, dozens of pairs of eyes focusing on Karen with laser intensity. She froze like a deer caught in headlights, her pale face clearly visible in the glow of the police emergency lights. There was no escape now, no way to deny her role in the evening's events. "You did this." David Chen's voice carried a note of incredulity that bordered on fury. "You called SWAT on the Washington family for making barbecue sauce." Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her usual confidence evaporating under the weight of communal judgment. She'd convinced herself she was protecting the neighborhood, being a responsible citizen, but faced with the reality of what her suspicions had unleashed, the justifications crumbled like sand. I thought," she began, her voice barely audible over the murmur of angry voices. The smell was so strong, So unusual. I thought they were. You thought what? Sarah Williams stepped forward, her voice sharp with protective anger. You thought a black family couldn't make good food without it being criminal. You called armed police on children because you didn't recognize barbecue spices. The accusations hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel or deny. Karen looked around desperately for support, for someone who might understand her perspective, but found only hostile faces and crossed arms. Even her longtime neighbors, people who had tolerated her complaints and suspicions for years, were looking at her with disgust. Inside the house, Marcus held his children close as Keisha began the impossible task of cleaning up the debris of their shattered evening. Little Marcus Jr. clung to his father's leg, his small body still trembling with residual fear. Zara had gone quiet, her 8-year-old mind struggling to process why armed strangers had invaded their home and pointed weapons at her family. "Daddy, are we safe now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the continuing commotion outside. "Are the bad men gone?" Marcus looked down at his daughter, his heart breaking at the fear in her innocent eyes. How could he explain that the bad men had been police officers, people she'd been taught to trust and respect? How could he help her understand that sometimes good people make terrible mistakes based on other people's prejudices? "We're safe, baby girl," he said softly, gathering both children into his arms. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big mistakes, but we're safe now, and we're going to be okay." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus wondered if they would ever truly be okay again. The violation of their home, the terror inflicted on his children, the public humiliation of being treated like criminals in their own neighborhood. These wounds would take much longer to heal than broken windows or overturned furniture. Keisha moved through the wreckage with clinical precision, her nursing training helping her compartmentalize the trauma and focus on immediate needs. The children required comfort and stability. The house needed to be secured for the night. Insurance companies would need to be contacted. But beneath her organized exterior, rage burned like a controlled fire. Outside, the confrontation between Karen and the neighbors was escalating. More people had arrived, drawn by the commotion and the rapidly spreading news of what had happened. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, representing almost every household on Maple Street and several from adjoining blocks. "This has to stop," declared James Murphy, a retired police officer who had moved to the neighborhood seeking quiet after 30 years on the force. "False reports like this don't just waste resources. They destroy families. They could have killed someone tonight." His words carried particular weight given his background, and several people nodded in agreement. Everyone understood how close the evening had come to genuine tragedy. SWAT raids were inherently dangerous, designed for situations where armed criminals posed immediate threats to public safety. Using such overwhelming force against a family making dinner was not just wrong, it was potentially deadly. "What if Marcus had been holding a kitchen knife when they came through that door?" James continued, his voice heavy with professional knowledge. "What if one of those officers had misinterpreted a movement, a gesture? This could have been a funeral, instead of just a neighborhood argument." The sobering reality of how much worse things could have gone settled over the crowd like a blanket. Karen seemed to shrink physically as the full implications of her actions became clear. She had set in motion events that could have resulted in the death of an innocent man in front of his children. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, tears finally beginning to flow down her pale cheeks. "I just thought. The smell was so strange, so strong. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood." Protecting us from what? Mrs. Rodriguez's voice cut through Karen's weak explanation. From the smell of good food. From a black family living peacefully in our neighborhood. What exactly were you protecting us from? The question hung unanswered because Karen herself couldn't articulate what had driven her to make the call. It wasn't the smell of the barbecue sauce, despite what she'd told herself. It was something deeper, more insidious, a collection of unconscious biases and learned prejudices that had led her to assume the worst about people who looked different from herself. The police officers finished their cleanup and documentation, leaving behind business cards with case numbers and formal apology letters. They would file reports detailing the false alarm. But the damage to the Washington family extended far beyond anything that would appear in official paperwork. As the crowd began to disperse, individual neighbors approached Marcus and Keisha with personal apologies and offers of help. Sarah Williams volunteered to watch the children the next day, while the parents dealt with insurance claims and window repairs. David Chen offered the use of his guest bedroom if the family needed a place to stay while their home was being fixed. The outpouring of support was genuine and touching, but it couldn't erase what had happened or prevent it from happening again to someone else. Everyone understood that Karen's phone call had been the symptom of a larger problem, one that required more than neighborly kindness to solve. 3 days later, the story broke in the local newspaper. An enterprising young journalist named Maria Santos had heard about the incident through her network of community contacts and recognized its significance immediately. Her article, titled "False Report Leads to SWAT Raid on Family Barbecue," appeared on the front page of Tuesday's edition with a photograph of the Washington family standing beside their still broken front window. The story spread rapidly through social media. Local television picked it up, and by Thursday morning, national news outlets were calling for interviews. The Washington family found themselves at the center of a media storm that thrust their private trauma into the public eye with uncomfortable intensity. Marcus struggled with the attention, preferring to handle the situation quietly within their community. But Keisha understood the broader implications of their experience and felt a responsibility to speak out about the dangerous consequences of racial profiling and false police reports. "If we stay silent, this will happen to another family," she told her husband during a quiet conversation after the children had gone to bed. "Maybe next time, someone won't be as lucky as we were. Maybe next time, there won't be barbecue sauce on the stove to prove innocence." The media attention intensified pressure on local authorities to take action. The district attorney's office announced an investigation into the false report, and the police department promised a review of their procedures for responding to neighbor complaints. But the Washington family wanted more than promises. They wanted accountability. Their attorney, David Martinez, filed both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit against Karen Pemberton. The criminal charges focused on filing a false police report and making false statements that endangered the welfare of children. The civil suit sought damages for emotional distress, property damage, and the violation of their civil rights. The legal proceedings would take months to resolve, but the court of public opinion moved much more quickly. Karen found herself ostracized from the community she had tried to protect, her own neighbors treating her with the same suspicion and hostility she had directed toward the Washington family. Her employer, a local insurance company where she had worked for 12 years, placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal charges. Her homeowners association, ironically enough, began receiving complaints about her behavior and its impact on neighborhood property values. The isolation was complete and devastating, forcing Karen to confront the reality of what her prejudices had cost, not just the Washington family, but herself and her standing in the community she had called home for nearly 4 decades. 2 months after the raid, the neighborhood association organized a community forum to address the broader issues raised by the incident. The meeting was held at Jefferson High School, in the auditorium where Marcus taught his students about the logical progression of mathematical proofs and the importance of evidence-based conclusions. Nearly 300 people attended, filling the auditorium beyond its normal capacity. Local officials, civil rights advocates, police representatives, and community members came together to discuss how such a devastating mistake could be prevented in the future. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady and measured as he described the impact of the raid on his family. He talked about his children's ongoing nightmares, Keisha's struggle to concentrate on her nursing studies, and his own loss of trust in the community he had thought of as home. "My daughter asked me last week if we were going to have to move," he said, his words carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "She wanted to know if it was safe for us to live here anymore. I didn't know how to answer her, because honestly, I don't know if it is." The silence that followed his statement was profound and uncomfortable. Many people in the audience had never considered how their black neighbors might feel, living in a predominantly white community, had never thought about the additional layer of vulnerability that came with being different in a place where different was often equated with dangerous. Keisha spoke next, her nursing background evident in her clinical description of trauma symptoms she had observed in her children. Sleep disturbances, anxiety about strangers, fear of loud noises. The psychological aftermath of the raid would require professional intervention and months of patient healing. "This wasn't just a mistake," she said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "This was the predictable result of assumptions and prejudices that our community has allowed to go unchallenged for too long. If we don't address the underlying problem, it will happen again." Police Chief Robert Davidson acknowledged the department's role in the incident and announced new protocols for responding to neighbor complaints. Officers would be required to conduct preliminary investigations before deploying tactical teams, and all personnel would receive additional training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. But the most dramatic moment of the evening came when Karen Pemberton herself took the podium. She had been largely invisible for the 2 months since the incident, but her attorney had advised her that a public apology might influence both the criminal proceedings and public sentiment. She looked fragile and diminished as she approached the microphone, her usual confidence replaced by visible shame and regret. The audience fell silent, hundreds of eyes focusing on the woman whose phone call had triggered the evening's traumatic events. "I want to apologize to the Washington family," she began, her voice barely audible over the sound system. "I want to apologize to this community. I want to apologize for my ignorance, my assumptions, and the terrible consequences of both." She paused, struggling to find words adequate to the magnitude of what she had done. "I convinced myself I was being a good neighbor, a responsible citizen. But the truth is, I was afraid of people I didn't understand, suspicious of a family whose only crime was being different from me." The apology continued for several minutes, but many in the audience found it inadequate to address the scale of harm she had caused. Apologies couldn't undo trauma, couldn't erase the memory of children screaming in terror as armed strangers invaded their home. When the formal presentations ended, the floor was open for community discussion. Person after person stood to share their own experiences with prejudice, their concerns about neighborhood safety, and their ideas for preventing similar incidents in the future. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about growing up as one of the few Latino families in the area, about the subtle and not-so-subtle ways she had been made to feel unwelcome over the years. David Chen described the assumptions people made about his family because of their Asian heritage, the way neighbors treated them as perpetual foreigners, despite having lived on Maple Street for 15 years. The stories painted a picture of a community that prided itself on tolerance, while harboring deep currents of suspicion and prejudice. The Washington family's trauma had exposed fault lines that had existed for years, invisible to those who had never experienced discrimination, but painfully obvious to those who had. Young people from Jefferson High School, many of them Marcus's students, spoke passionately about the need for change. They organized petition drives, social media campaigns, and educational initiatives designed to address implicit bias and promote genuine understanding between different racial and ethnic groups. The forum lasted nearly 4 hours, ending only when the school custodian reminded everyone that the building needed to be secured for the night. But the conversations continued in parking lot clusters, in coffee shops and living rooms, as community members grappled with uncomfortable truths about their shared home. 6 months after the raid, Karen Pemberton pleaded guilty to filing a false police report and was sentenced to 200 hours of community service, all to be performed with organizations focused on racial justice and community healing. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that allowed the Washington family to move to a larger house in a more diverse neighborhood. Marcus took a teaching position at a school district that actively recruited educators of color and valued his experience. Keisha completed her nursing program with highest honors and accepted a position at the county hospital where she specialized in trauma counseling. The children gradually healed from their psychological wounds, helped by professional counseling and the loving support of their extended family. Zara developed an interest in law enforcement reform, inspired by her family's experience and her desire to prevent similar tragedies. Little Marcus Jr. learned to sleep through the night again, no longer waking from nightmares about armed strangers invading his home. The Maple Street neighborhood established a community diversity council, organized regular cultural events, and created educational programs designed to address unconscious bias. The house where the Washingtons had lived was purchased by another black family, who were welcomed with genuine warmth by neighbors determined not to repeat past mistakes. Karen Pemberton completed her community service and left the area, selling her house and moving to another state where her notoriety hadn't followed her. Before leaving, she made a final attempt to apologize to the Washington family, but they declined to meet with her. Some wounds they had learned required distance and time to heal properly. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the night his family's life was turned upside down by someone's prejudices and assumptions, he would always return to the lesson he tried to teach his mathematics students: the importance of evidence, the danger of false conclusions, and the need to check your work before acting on incomplete information. Numbers don't lie, he would say, but people do. Sometimes they lie to others, but more often, they lie to themselves. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about people we don't know, assumptions we make without evidence, conclusions we reach without proof. The barbecue sauce recipe, passed down through 3 generations of Washington men, continued to fill weekend air with its rich, complex aroma. But now it was prepared in a different backyard, surrounded by neighbors who understood that unfamiliar didn't mean dangerous. That different was often just another word for wonderful. And on quiet Saturday evenings, when the smell of brown sugar and molasses and carefully measured spices drifted through their new neighborhood, the Washington family could finally enjoy their dinner in peace, knowing that the people around them saw barbecue sauce for exactly what it was: love, tradition, and the simple pleasure of feeding family with recipes that carried the warmth of generations in every aromatic breath.